chokwadi pasi pano taiona moto marongera vanoita wepanyika vanoda kudisu vamwe tioneswe moto dapasina kupindira.
Welcome to the situation right now with me, your host as usual, Dara B. Now, you need to understand as a citizen of Zimbabwe or a citizen of any country that knowing your constitution, constitutional literacy is the cornerstone of democracy. If you don't know your constitution, you can never exert your rights. You can never fully benefit from being a citizen of a country. Since our constitution was put in place in 2013, there has been little effort from government, or actually no effort from government, to ensure that all the people know the constitution. Now, with the help of civic society and non-governmental organizations, we are now having an attempt so that there is constitutional literacy in our society. Now, the Center for Human Rights, in partnership with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and are bringing in what we call the Zimbabwe Constitutional Literacy booklet, which is going to be launched on the 16th of November in Harare. And we are going to be discussing what that book entails, why is it important, and why should you care? I mean, we always bring you the conversations on why you should care. So join me after this break on the situation right now with me host Dara B on HSTV. Welcome back to the situation right now, where we are going to be talking the constitution, why you should care. I mean, we always hear people say he has been denied his constitutional rights. He is being held, like Job Scala right now is being held for over 150 days in remand prison without trial. Is that constitutional? Now we're going to be talking about those constitutional rights. Now, to help me discuss this, I have a panel that is coming from the Center for Human Rights, and we're going to be discussing the constitutional rights, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves so that I give them the opportunity to shine. I'll start with you, my brother Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Dara B. So my name is Lloyd Kuvea, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Human Rights, based at the University of Pretoria. I'm responsible mainly for advocacy operations of the center, as well as some of our projects implementation. Hence why I'm here today in the company of my colleague Bonolo.
Yes, now I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself. You're from South Africa. My very first import on this program.
I love it for me. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Bonolo Makhale, and I am the Program Manager of the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit of the Center for Human Rights. Part of my work is to spearhead the center's efforts in promotion of human rights, democracy, and civic engagement on the continent. And hence, this work on constitutional literacy actually falls under the unit that I manage. And thank you so much again for having us.
I'll just go straight and start with you. What is the importance of this booklet?
So there are a few things. We, as the center, so let me start with the center. One of our main mission is literally to promote human rights in Africa, and of course that looks different, and we do quite a lot of work around the rights of children, the rights of women, advocacy, and so on and so forth. But for this one in particular, we realize that the recognition and fulfillment of human rights in Africa is quite low, despite comprehensive and elaborate constitutions that we have. Because naturally, ordinary citizens would not know what the constitution looks like. In fact, there was a study I read last week in my country that about 60% of ordinary citizens do not actually know what is in the constitution,
wow.
Do not actually know the provisions of the Bill of Rights. And so part of this project is to take the law to citizens, because if you don't know the provisions of your constitution, if you don't know your constitutional rights, how do you protect yourself in an event of gross human rights violations? And like I said earlier, the promotion of human rights is relatively low, and inevitably it has led to a lot of gross human rights violations of citizens, and citizens do not know or have the capacity or the skills or the knowledge to protect themselves if they are violated. And so essentially part of this project is to promote human rights, but also to raise awareness, because I think a knowledgeable citizen is then able to know what to do in an event that there's gross human rights violations.
We're promoting knowledge, but looking at the background of this book, you center around the section 2 of the Constitution. Now, I want us, maybe before we go in depth, to just give us an overview of the book. What does it contain? What are its strongest points?
Yeah, so thank you very much. Let me also just start by saying, as the Center for Human Rights, we are not just an NGO that does advocacy, but we are also an academic institution. So it's a hybrid kind of institution. And so part of what we then do besides the advocacy is training, training not just communities and vulnerable people, so that they are able to fight for their rights, but also we even train state delegates and policymakers, so that they themselves, because they are the duty bearers, are able to ensure that people's rights are protected, because they've got the powers to do that. So that's what we do, and we run a number of programs, academic programs. We've got 5 master's programs. We run 10 short human rights courses, and we've got 10 projects. So it's really a lot of work that we're doing. So to answer your question on this particular project, we decided to focus on the Bill of Rights. Because for us, it's important to focus on the Bill of Rights, given, I think, the history of Zimbabwe in terms of its human rights situation. As you know, right now, we've got the Commonwealth delegation in Zimbabwe coming to assess the human rights situation. So these are critical issues, and Zimbabwe is trying to get back into the Commonwealth, and it cannot do that if the human rights situation is not okay. So for us, we decided to focus on the Bill of Rights, and we've done that in other countries as well, not just Zimbabwe. And so for us, these are rights that affect the ordinary people, the marginalized, the vulnerable, the voiceless. Issues like right to education, for instance. Not many people understand the content of what it means to have access to education, whether it is at primary school level, high school level, or tertiary level. What is the content of the right to health, for instance? And I think you've heard even some other journalists and critics have always talked about the issue of right to health in Zimbabwe. In particular, especially after the COVID crisis and during the COVID crisis, there was a lot of talk about how health in Zimbabwe is not really being promoted and being fulfilled. And so people need to know what are the obligations of the government. So hence why we started from Article 2. The government has obligations. All institutions of government have obligations to ensure that these rights are protected. So if it's a hospital, they have a right to ensure that people have access to health when they need it, and it must be adequate, it must be accessible, and so on and so forth. You talk about fair trial rights, and you mentioned Job Sikala. A lot of people who are indigent, who have no access to legal representation, they need to understand what are their rights, fair trial rights, when they are in, for instance, in pre-trial detention. The fact that emphasis like bail is not a privilege, it is a right. So everyone must be able to at least apply for it when they appear before a magistrate. And also, people should not be held in pre-trial detention for too long before their trial actually comes up. So someone is actually being punished before they've been convicted. So these are all the things that that booklet is talking about. And I think Bonolo will talk more about its contents, but for me, the fact that it has been translated into Shona and Ndebele, that is amazing. And it means that ordinary people are going to be empowered. And this is not just for ordinary people, but also policymakers will be able to even look at that. Police officers prison officers. These are the people who deal with people, on a one-to-one basis every day. Nurses, they'll be able to read that and understand what is the content of the right to health and make sure that people have that right to health. Members of Parliament, they can also read that simplified version of the Bill of Rights and understand the content of the rights that we're talking about.
But Lloyd, many say that in Africa it's not about the knowledge, it's about the implementation.
That's the thing. So the devil is in the implementation, that we say that at least on the continent. So for me, this is why, what Bonolo through a leadership, is trying to do. So if you then get people to understand these rights, you have empowered them to demand these rights from the political leaders, from their parliamentary representatives. Even when they go to let's say the Department of Home Affairs, and they want their citizenship to be sorted out, or they want a passport, or they want a birth certificate, they'll be able to say, look, the Constitution says my child must have a birth certificate. The Constitution says, as a Zimbabwean citizen, I must be able to have my ID and a passport when I want it, that sort of thing. So you've empowered the person to vindicate her rights, not just in the courtroom, but even with service providers that they come across. So I think that implementation for me is what we are trying to then look at. You can't implement if you don't understand and if you don't know what your right is. And they can even also go to court, if their rights are violated. They'll be able to vindicate their rights, either through approaching civil society organizations in Zimbabwe that do public interest litigation to say, look, I feel my rights have been violated in this way. May you please represent me? Then these guys will then go to court and ensure that these rights are protected, and so on and so forth.
I want to carry the point from Lloyd that says that you've managed to do this in English, Shona and Ndebele, but there's been an argument in this era that most of our young people don't want to read. They don't want to read. How do you propose to reach these young people? Because they are millennials, more of the TikTok video kind of generation.
Before I answer your question, can I just
please go ahead.
add something there on the issue of accountability, or rather implementation, right? A knowledgeable citizen would be able to hold the state accountable in an event that there's no access to clean water or something like that, right? And I think it's important to note that this idea of human rights and the fulfillment of the Bill of Rights, it's no longer a pink fluffy thing in the sky. It's no longer a contemplative subject. It's actually a very important ingredient in terms of governance, in terms of participation, but also in terms of accountability. We see a lot of impunity, right? And if I don't know that I have the right to hold the state accountable, then I would not be able to hold the state accountable.
But when people know they have the right to hold the state accountable, but they're bashed, they're beaten up on the streets when they're trying to hold the state accountable, and they don't have guns. The state has guns.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
It is a very unfortunate thing, and I think this is not just a Zimbabwean thing, right? Even in a country that I come from, there's this strange relationship between the state and vulnerable groups. You remember during 2020, the state enforced a lot of unconstitutional emergency laws that we saw the army using force. Particularly in South Africa, we had a man called Khoza. I forgot his first name, but his last name was Khoza. He was killed by the army in a township called Alexandra. So I don't know what the context looks like in Zimbabwe, but if I may make an example with South Africa, in South Africa it's always a case of class and race. I always say, as a black woman living in an urban area, no police officer will dare try to violate me, because they know that I know my rights and I can take them to court. But they'll go to peri-urban areas. They'll go to Alexandra they'll go to a village. So you see, it's not just an issue of race, it's not just an issue of me being black. A black woman my age who lives in Alexandra, the chances of her being violated by a police officer are very high in comparison to me, right? And so what we do, particularly within organizations like the Center for Human Rights and other institutions that are doing a lot of litigation and supporting vulnerable groups, and I think this is very important. We must remember that even in courts, it's very difficult to find justice even in the courtroom. In South Africa, where we have the highest rate of gender-based violence, there's so many cases of women that have been raped, that have been murdered, and nothing has been done about it. And what civil society organizations are doing on this continent is to say, we recognize the failures of the state, and we are going to do something on the margins of the state because we recognize the failures of the state. But while we do that, we do both, right? We empower citizens, and we equally challenge states when they fail to do what they've committed to me, because I voted you in power. You promised to do all of these things, right? And I agree with you, because also sometimes we say these things because they sound nice. I was having a conversation with my mother the other day about the new forms of governance in South Africa, coalition governance and local governments. And my mom was like, I actually don't care about coalition governance. I want clean water.
Exactly.
She's like, so whether it's the DA or the EFF, I don't care. I want clean water. And I think we really must, when we think about this, when we have these high-level conversations, we must really think about what does that look like
on the ground.
On the ground, and for an ordinary citizen who doesn't know. And I think these efforts is part of it. Part of this work is that, and I agree with you, we live in a digital world. I was saying earlier that I always have a notebook in my handbag because I like to make notes. But today I was like, okay, let me just carry my cell phone, right? Because we live in a world where everything is here on our fingers. So these booklets, we have them in hard copies, but we also have them electronically. We'll disseminate them widely in all our social media platforms, on our websites, and we've been saying this to our partners that, they mustn't worry, we're not gonna have copyright issues. Send it to wherever you want to send to. And the hard copies that we have now in Harare will make sure that also they are distributed across the parts of this country. Those who don't have access to electronic devices can look at it and read it. How many people and this is the thing why I'm passionate about this project, right? I'm not a lawyer. And I find law very confusing.
That makes two of us. Yeah.
Sometimes when these lawyers speak, I'm like, do you even know what you're saying?
You
know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what I like about this project is that it takes the law and it simplifies it. Uses language that is accessible. You see, language matters.
It does.
Language matters. And sometimes we use this high-level language and we are talking to ourselves. So what we did here, we took the legal document without watering it down and we simplified it. So for those who can read it in English, they're able to understand the simplified version of it. But also if we want to reach a broader population, because also these things, most of the time they are centered in urban areas where people understand English. There are other parts of the country where people don't know English, but they speak Shona, they speak Ndebele. And so part of, increasing constitutional literacy and making this thing that is important for citizens, we used language because language matters.
Amazing. And I wanted to ask if you're going to use audio and visuals, because some say radio is the medium for development in Africa.
Yeah.
Because some of us, our grandmothers, also want to have this understanding of the Constitution, but they can't read, but they can listen.
Yeah. That's actually a good point. We've been thinking about this as well. We have a unit that works around the disability rights, right? And one of the members of that unit actually challenged me, and they were like, are you going to also translate this in Braille, right, for people who are visually impaired? And I think we may need to also think about creative ways to say beyond the text. Audio is also very important. Think about just we get somebody who can read what is on the booklet itself, and we have it in audio, and it will also increase how accessible it is. So for now we only have it in text, but I do think that this is something that we could think about going forward and having in audio.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that point, which is very important, Dara. And I mean, I feel attacked because I'm a lawyer, so I'll try to simplify what I say. But anyway, look, I love this idea of the radio. Bonolo is going to be on radio in the afternoon to talk about the what is contained in the booklets. What I think we will do, because we're going to disseminate, as Bonolo has said, widely across the country. And I think we should target community radios, so that the community radio stations will actually be able to talk about these rights, during some of their programs. And also, our colleagues who are going to be doing community outreaches now in the communities will have copies of these booklets, and they can go and use them to train people, to explain to people, in the spoken word that they understand. So thanks for that. I think we will utilize that medium as well of communication.
Amazing. But if you also go on internet, I'm sure there are a number of softwares that can convert text into audio. Instead of reading, you can actually listen to books. I was amazingly thrilled, when someone just showed me this app. I forget the name of it, but instead of reading, you just put your earphones, you open the book, and audio starts coming through. So viewers, you can take advantage of some of these applications on internet to listen when you're tired of reading. But going back to what's part of the background that I received from you, Bonolo, says the Declaration of Rights provides for various rights, including civil and political rights, socio-economic, environmental, and cultural rights, as well as protection for specific categories of people, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and veterans of the liberation struggle. Now, my interest is on political rights, Bono. And every time there is an awareness on political rights, political parties or the ruling elites feel threatened. And if you come to Zimbabwe, there is an attempt to silence civil society, because part of their work is to make people aware of their political rights. It's to make people aware of these various rights. Now let's talk about this one.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre for me how the state feels so threatened by the idea of a citizen that understands its rights. It's such a bizarre thing for me, right? And I was actually having a conversation with somebody a couple of days ago, because South Africa is going on to elections in 2024. Zimbabwe has elections next year. And we were thinking about how do we enhance political and political rights of citizens. And my friend said something to me that I found fascinating. And he said, oftentimes we talk about this idea of civic education as if citizens actually do not know of their political rights. And he was saying it's because citizens are not engaged. States are not intentional about engaging citizens about their political rights. And then we've got regimes like Zimbabwe where force is used to threaten citizens when they want to exercise their political rights. And I think it's a difficult one, because on the one hand, the Constitution says, and we didn't make up these things, right? It's a document from the government that talks about my right to vote, my right to exercise political right, however it looks like. And the same institution, the same body that told me that I have this right, it's the same one that pushes back when I want to exercise my right. And I think it's such a bizarre thing. And then I think part of it is what I mentioned earlier, that unfortunately in most parts of the continent, there's this strange relationship that the state has with citizens, and it's the weirdest thing. I keep saying this within the South African context, and I'm sorry to keep going back to my context. Think about during the apartheid era, the white government violated black people, right? Post 1994, there's this thing South Africa is celebrated to have the best constitution in the world. There's this constitutional triumphalism. The international community is celebrating that Madiba, hey, apartheid ended without civil war, and. 28 years later, it's a mess in my country, right? And who's governing South Africa? It's a black government. So it was okay for the black government, it was okay for the African National Congress back then to fight the white government for violating their political rights. I mean, we didn't even have political rights at that time. But to violate just your human rights, the fact that I'm a human being and I couldn't participate in matters of governance, right? The white government violated that right. Black government comes in and takes power, and we see the black government doing the same thing. And I really struggle, and perhaps I think one of the things that we must think about, both as citizens and the state, and African states must think about this, is this idea of democracy that we have. I think fundamentally we have a very flawed idea of democracy in Africa. And once we keep playing these games of us and the state, because I think, and in theology they call it humanetics of suspicion. The state naturally suspicious of us, and we are also suspicious of the state. And until there comes a time where non-state actors and the state come together and say, actually we are a mess, how do we come together? And we saw that in 2020 in South Africa, when COVID happened. President Cyril Ramaphosa literally went on national TV and he was like, we need help. And a lot of non-state actors went and supported the state. And I think if the state lets go of this humanetics of suspicion, and if we also, because and rightfully so, we are very suspicious of them. Evidence proves that they don't like us, right? But if we come together and think about what we want to see in our communities and what we want to see on our continent, perhaps there may be some hope. But this is the thing, we keep doing this work. I probably won't be here in the next 40 years. But I'm hoping that my nieces and my nephews will be like, our aunt was one of the people that actually laid the foundation. We may still have violations of rights by states to its citizens in the next 40 years, hopefully not, or in the next 50 years. But this conversation is important because this conversation is building onto something that we are. In Africa, I keep saying to people, part of the work that I do is because I have an idea of Africa that is contradictory to what I see today. I have this imagination that I want to see a different Africa. And I may not see it, but I'm hoping that those that come behind me would be able to see it.
Now, Lloyd, what is your greatest, what is your fear? Because when we do these things, we are looking to solve a mischief, and here we are, civil society is the one that's taking a lead to try and make sure that people understand their constitutional rights, and here government is trying to ensure that civil society does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your fear? What is your greatest fear around all this thing that is happening?
Well, that's a very loaded question, Darabi. And I wanted to contextualize it as well by bringing us back to Zim. And I like what Bonolo said, about the state of democracy in Africa. And we need to keep working at it until we get it right. And I wanted to just contextualize it, by taking us back from soon after independence, where the then president wanted to establish a one-party state that cannot be challenged. There's no opposition. There's no civil society that criticizes government. There's no independent media that criticizes government. So you take away freedom of expression. You take away freedom of association. You take away freedom of assembly. You literally destroy independent media. You also destroy civil society. And remember, when President Mugabe was still in power, there were even attempts to come up with a new NGO Act, which was also designed to silence civil society. And now, with the current government of President Mnangagwa, they are doing the same thing, coming up with a PVO amendment bill, again designed to silence civil society organizations. So there's always that thing that Bonolo was talking about, how our leaders want to consolidate power. They are saying, let's be united, let there be no opposition, let there be no critics like Langarembwa and Darabi and other people who criticize things that they are seeing happening. And let us now focus on development. But that's not it. Civil and political rights are still important. So for us, our fear as civil society, as an academic, as a lawyer, as an ordinary citizen of Zimbabwe, is that politicians do not grasp this thing that you cannot silence people when they want to speak out. You can't take away people's voices. You cannot destroy civil society because civil society are there to speak on behalf of the voiceless, on behalf of the vulnerable members of community who do not understand what their rights are perhaps, and who need the support of civil society organizations. I'll give you the example of what happened in 2019 in Zimbabwe, where people were shot. About 17 people died at that time. Up to now, the families of the people who were killed in broad daylight have not been compensated. Civil society organizations have been struggling and crying out for justice. I remember one of the people who was affected was this young man, Choto, and the father got assistance from the, Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. They went to court to vindicate the rights of the deceased. So I think, if you take away civil society, if you take away independent media, you are really taking away the rights of people, their ability to be able to vindicate their rights through civil society organizations, through independent media. And for me, that's my biggest fear, that if the government does that, we're now going back to the Stone Age, where people are not allowed to speak out and so on and so forth. And yet, we look at even what happened to Tsitsi Dangarembwa when she was convicted, just for expressing herself on issues that are important, that are affecting ordinary people. That for me, that is wrong. And I think you saw as well the United Nations special rapporteurs who issued a statement on government's attempts to muzzle civil society. They said this is so wrong in a modern world where we are trying to promote democracy, where we are trying to protect people's civil and political rights. You can't be doing that. That is retrogressive. So I hope that the government will stop that, really. Is there any real development in any nation if people can't speak?
No. So there's this thing we must understand, and there's this ongoing conversation about democracy versus development, right? China, case in point, right? But we must remember that democracy and development are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist, right? And I think, for me, just shortly to answer your question, I think in all forms of government, democracy actually brings sustainable development.
Yeah.
There can never be sustainable development if there's no democracy. And so I always caution people that we must not really be manipulated by this game that says, I've given you good road infrastructures, I've given you water and sanitation, but then you take away the basic right to express myself. Because inherently human beings want freedom, right? I'll feed you, but I feed you and I lock you in. That doesn't change anything. I will still want to set myself free, even after you have fed me and given me everything that I want. So there can never be sustainable development without democracy, and we must accept that the two are mutually exclusive. And then it goes back to what I said, that while we are that, then, and I still don't have an answer for this, but we must start thinking about the kind of democracy that we see, because what we have now has proven that it's not working for us.
I want to ride on that point. I was in America recently observing the elections and reporting on the elections, and it appears that we have looked at America as the leader of democracy, but they were also complaining that their government is trying to take away their rights. that there's a lot of intimidation during elections and stuff like that. So does democracy really work? Is this thing called democracy even really real?
I mean, I also think it's wild. It's wild how we give the West too much attention in Africa, honestly, truly. But I also think context matters as well. And perhaps we also adopted some of, democratic forms that worked in Western societies and civilizations that are not necessarily relevant within our African context. But also because the West has decided for us, even to a certain extent. And so a challenge that I always bring across is that there's a need for an intellectual project here for Africans by Africans. Because half the time there's an obsession in adopting models from the West without considering. Let me give an example. In South Africa during Mbeki's administration, President Thabo Mbeki brought a new education, I don't know what they called it, but it was called OBE. I don't even know what OBE stands for. I think I was out of school already at that time. But it was actually a very interesting model. It was an interactive way of teaching kids, and perhaps I'm even misrepresenting it, but I remember it was called OBE. It lasted for about 3 years. When they went and did policy reviews, both children and teachers couldn't connect. It wasn't working, but it worked. It worked exceptionally well in America. And the point I'm making is that it worked there. It is a policy that worked specifically for a particular context. And when the Minister of Education during President Thabo's time saw this, that it had worked in America, they figured, oh, this is great, let's bring it in South Africa. But the context is different. And so my thing is, there's a need, and I may not be able to answer your question in the most pragmatic way, but I think there's a need for an intellectual project, and not even just an intellectual project, even an activist project. There's a need for politicians and members of the academia, members of the media, ordinary citizens, to think about what democracy looks like, a democracy by Africans for Africans. I'm a dreamer. I don't know, but it's a thing that I've been thinking about.
I want to take, this is a very interesting discussion, Dara, because, and Bonola, thanks for raising Mbeki. One of our, thought leaders on the continent. And he always wanted to ensure that the regional norms are implemented at the domestic level. So as you know, we've got the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which is a document by Africans for Africans to talk about their democratic dispensation and democratization on the continent. And I think that, that document is one of the most progressive that Africa has adopted. And I think this is why, for instance, the African Union is also very strict about this issue of unconstitutional changes of government, because that disturbs progress, that disturbs democracy, that disturbs development. Now, if there's chaos in a country, there's no democracy, elections are not being held, unconstitutional changes of government, conflicts. We've seen that in Ethiopia, we've seen it in Chad, we've seen it in Mali, all these countries that where these things are happening. It means that even in Mozambique recently, it means that investors will then be scared to come and invest. So that actually impedes development. And so I think the idea of ensuring that there's democratization, we're actually going to attract more investors into our country. And I think that's the direction we should be taking, rather than to have autocratic states, where investors will be like, do I really want to go into this country? If I then have my investment there, what's going to happen? Will I be able to vindicate my rights in a court of law? So you find that there's also a very close link between democracy and constitutionalism, rule of law, and human rights. You see now. So an investor will not want to come to a country where there's no respect for human rights, where there's no respect for property rights, where there's no respect for rule of law, where there are no independent courts, where if things go wrong, they are not able to approach a court of law, where the issue will be adjudicated by independent and competent judges. So they'll be scared to come. So I think for me, that's where I think our leaders need to think more about that in terms of what do they really want for the countries that they are leading. I think the people
may I weigh in on something quickly that Lloyd has said. this idea of unconstitutional changes of democracy in Africa, and I'll probably get myself in trouble for this, but that's okay. So we have these beautiful documents, these from the African Union, right? And we saw this happen in Zimbabwe in 2017.
Just 2 days from now.
Yes, actually yes.
Just 2 days from today.
We saw this happen in Mali last year or this year?
Yes.
When there was a coup. And hear me well, it is unconstitutional. But I also think that the African Union is not paying attention
To what the people want.
to what the people want. And I think if we are to talk about these unconstitutional changes of democracy and what democratization in Africa looks like, we must pay attention to the voices of citizens. When Zimbabweans went to the streets in 2019 and celebrated, when citizens of Mali went to the streets last year and celebrated when there was a coup, they were actually saying, we have a governance issue here. We have a problem. And perhaps the military is our only solution. And that's scary.
It is.
That's scary. So my thing has always been that we have these beautiful documents, Lloyd, and it goes back to the question you asked earlier, that how do we measure that these documents are good if they are not well implemented? What is the good? So there's this thing about South Africa has good policies. So how did you decide that those policies are good if they are not implemented? How do you decide that the Constitution of South Africa is the best constitution in Africa, because we are obsessed with this constitutional triumphalism when half of the population does not have clean water? So I really think that we must get over these lights, camera things from the African Union and from our governments, because if they paid attention, then they will think about what good governance looks like, and they will keep their own cronies to account.
So Julius Malema speaks to the issue that you're speaking about when he was in Zimbabwe at the time when the late ousted President Robert Mugabe died. I asked him what he thinks about SADC and AU, and his simple answer was, these are just old people protecting themselves and not listening to the voices of the people. But as we close, Lloyd, I want to read this part which says, constitutional literacy also informs citizens of the obligations upon themselves and the state in their interaction with each other. Now, this statement to me looks like it's a building harmony and understanding between parties, and also importantly, where it says obligations upon themselves, also gives a sense of responsibility to the citizens.
Yeah.
I want us to talk about this. Is this just a glossy way of saying things, or this is a real statement? Because if this is real, I just don't understand why government is afraid.
So I think, let me take you back to what Bonolo said about suspicion, that there's mutual suspicion.
Created by the state in most of the time?
Created by the state most of the time. So there's paranoia, there's suspicion. I actually wonder why, what's going on here? And yet, what I've always found interesting is that when we come together in the same room, government and civil society, independent media, you name it, we make progress. We do much more than when we're shouting at each other from across the street and you say, no, you are to blame and you are to blame. But the thing is, when you look at and Bonolo was talking about the African brand of democracy, there's also the African brand of human rights. Let's go to the African Charter. Let's start there. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is a document universally signed up to and ratified by African states, except for Morocco. But that document talks about human rights and also duties. So there are responsibilities and duties. And everybody has got these duties. So we've got the duty bearers, who are the policymakers, who are supposed to provide all these things. But also we find that even individuals also have a duty. As a citizen, I have a duty as well as a citizen. I should be able to, I shouldn't be fearing government. I should be able to engage with government institutions and to say, look here, you're violating my rights here. And this is what the Constitution says. This is what the African Charter which you signed up to is saying about your obligations. And so let's talk about this. We shouldn't be suspecting each other. We shouldn't be fearing each other. I should be able to walk up to a member of parliament and saying, look, I don't feel that as Bonolo is saying, I don't feel that the rights that are in the Constitution, which is so beautiful, I don't think that they are being implemented on the ground. I mean, come on, we've got no hospital. I mean, you've got the Doma people there in Mashonaland Central who do not have access to resources, who don't have, they have to walk long distances, kilometers, just to access a school or a hospital. They should be able to say that to their member of parliament who represents them, to say, look, on the ground, we are not seeing this happening. So for me, that's what I would want to see happening, where not just the state doing these things in the ivory towers, but coming to where the people are. Somebody made this phrase the other time that we need to take it to the people. Take it to where the people are and make sure that you deliver on service. People don't want a lot of things. They would, like Bonolo says, people want clean water, they want health, they want education. Whether you are in the rural areas or in the urban sector, that's what people are calling for. And I think government should meet the people where they are and deliver.
Amazing. So tomorrow, which is the 16th of November, the Zimbabwean Constitutional Literacy booklet will actually be launched. Now, it's important for citizens to be part of their governance structures. It's important for the citizens to question government. It's important for citizens to demand accountability. And we are going to be having a loaded program that's going to start at around 10. And we're going to be having powerful speakers. The beautiful will be moderating. And you could just see her energy. But just of interest here is one of our own, Namatai Kwekweza, young, passionate lady who talks constitutionalism, sleeps constitutionalism. She was arrested by the state for demanding that this government, our government, should implement the constitution instead of amending a constitution that has not even been implemented. Wow. And she's still appearing before the courts. We also have Dr. Musa Kika, who's going to be speaking. Dr. Musa Kika, if you are aware, is famous for challenging Justice Luke Malaba's extension as the Chief Justice of Zimbabwe. He actually won that case before there was an appeal. But just before the appeal, there was a strong statement from the state, a statement written by the Minister of Justice, warning judges and saying that our enemy, it's time to poke our enemies in the eye. Now this is democracy. Now I'll just allow you to do concluding remarks. What do you think, not from a question from me, but an issue that you think is pressing?
I think for me, and going back to the conversations that we had, and I suppose it's because where I am right now, I've been doing quite a lot of reading around democracy, because I am lamenting, but also I always say in my lament, it calls me to action. And so I think one of the things I want to see, and this is something that the South African government came up with, I think it was during President Madiba's administration. It's a phrase in my language that says "batubele," which basically means let's put people first. And I think one of the things that I want to see, not just in Zimbabwe, not just in South Africa, but in this entire continent, I really think I want to see governments putting people first, because they are in government because we put them there.
Yeah.
And the question I keep asking when I think about the role of political parties and politicians in Africa is to say, to challenge them to think about, is this for great administration? Is this for good governance? Is this because you want to respond and take care of our basic needs, and service delivery imperatives that you've made? And I think for me, one of the things that are very important to me at this stage in my life is to that very simple thing that South Africa came up with during Madiba's administration, batubele. Let's really put people at the center of our democracy and our governance. And once we do that, it will be able to help us answer quite a lot of questions that we are grappling with at the moment.
Amazing.
Yeah. Look, thanks, Tara. I've got two messages. One for the Speaker of Parliament, Jacob Mdenda, and the second one for the President of Zimbabwe, Comrade Emerson Mnangagwa. Now, I think I remember 5 years or so ago, when I was still director at the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, Jacob Mdenda made a clarion call to civil society. He said, I really wish that one day civil society will carry out a constitutional literacy project. And I just want to say to Comrade Mdenda, the Center for Human Rights, with Bonolo leading here, have answered that clarion call. We are taking constitutional literacy to the people of Zimbabwe so that they are empowered and they are able to understand their rights and also to vindicate their rights. Then my second message is to the President of Zimbabwe, President Mnangagwa, and say, look, the government must not impede the work of civil society. The government of Zimbabwe must allow civil society to do their work. And this is the sort of thing that will happen if civil society is allowed to do their work without any political reprisals, without any persecution, without any restriction. We are answering that call as an NGO, but also as an academic institution that is working in the continent at the regional level and partnering with our colleagues in Zimbabwe to take this constitutional literacy project to the people. Thank you.
Amazing. Now, constitutional supremacy also creates binding obligations to every person in the state, including state organs and government agencies. The 2013 Constitution is heralded as a constitution of the people as the result of the consultative process during the constitution-making process. Increased knowledge of what this constitution means and can do for the people of this is thus central to this constitution truly being one of the people and one for the people. And if you read the constitution, it starts with we the people.
Yes.
Let's do it for our people. Let's improve the way of life of our people by ensuring that their rights are respected and the constitution remains the supreme law of the land, with its rights to the people being upheld. Now this is, and this was, and this will always be the situation right now. With me, your host as usual, Dara B. Thank you for joining